The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded too neatly for the damage it was about to cause. I remember standing at the kitchen counter, coffee cooling beside me, staring at my own name printed above a sentence that made no sense. According to the HOA, my 4,000-acre farm had been sold. Not discussed, not disputed, sold. At first, I laughed, the kind of laugh you use when something is so absurd it can't possibly be real. This land had been in my family for generations. Every fence post, every boundary line, every acre was legally documented. And HOA couldn't just sell it. That's what I thought. But the laughter stopped when I read the next paragraph. There was a buyer. There was a recorded transaction. There was even a reference number. My hands started to shake, not from fear, but from confusion turning into anger. I stepped outside and looked across the field stretching to the horizon, the same land I walked every morning. Somewhere out there, according to a group of people who lived miles away in neat identical houses, this no longer belonged to me. I drove straight to the HOA office. No phone calls, no emails. I wanted faces. When I walked in, the room went quiet. The board president leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She told me, calmly, that the land had been reclassified years ago under an old clause I had supposedly agreed to. A clause I had never seen. A clause that conveniently gave them authority over property they never owned. They spoke in rehearsed sentences, legal words stacked together like a wall meant to block questions. When I asked for proof, they handed me copies, not originals. When I asked who approved the sale, they said it was handled internally. That's when I realized something was very wrong. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move. Driving back home, I felt two choices pulling at me. Panic, or patience. Most people would have exploded, threatened lawsuits, maybe even gone public immediately. I did something else. I stayed quiet. Because if the HOA thought I was powerless, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. What they didn't know was that one legal detail they ignored would soon turn their entire neighborhood upside down. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was scared of losing the land, but because something about the HOA's confidence bothered me. They weren't guessing. They weren't bluffing. They believed they were untouchable. By morning, I had made a decision. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't protest. I would read every document, every amendment, every forgotten line buried in paperwork most people never bother opening. I started with the original property deed, the one my grandfather signed decades ago. Then I moved to zoning maps, easement filings, and county records that hadn't been digitized yet. Hours turned into days. My dining table disappeared under stacks of paper. Somewhere in those pages was the reason the HOA thought they could sell land they never paid for. And eventually, I found it. It was a clause buried deep inside an HOA amendment from years earlier, written in vague language and passed during a meeting almost no one attended. The clause talked about administrative authority over adjacent parcels, for maintenance purposes. Nothing about ownership, nothing about sale rights, but the HOA had twisted it, stretching its meaning far beyond what the law allowed. They counted on one thing. No one would challenge it. What caught my attention wasn't just what the clause said. It was what it ignored. There was a state statute that clearly limited HOA authority when it came to agricultural land. Farms over a certain size were protected under a separate classification. My property didn't just qualify. It exceeded the threshold by thousands of acres. That meant the HOA's amendment wasn't just invalid. It was illegal. Still, I didn't move. I didn't confront them again. Instead, I visited the county recorder's office. I asked questions quietly. I requested certified copies. The clerk raised an eyebrow when she saw the acreage listed under my name. She confirmed what I already suspected. No lawful transfer had ever taken place. The sale existed only in HOA paperwork, not in county records. That's when the bigger picture became clear. The HOA hadn't sold my farm to take it away from me. They had sold it to create leverage. Control the land, control access, control everything around it. They assumed I'd panic, negotiate, or back down. What they didn't realize was that their mistake didn't weaken my position. It strengthened it, because the same clause they abused opened a door they never saw coming. And once I stepped through it, the balance of power would shift completely. The HOA still thought they were in charge. They had no idea the law was about to turn against them. Over the next few weeks, the HOA behaved as if the issue were already settled. They posted notices near the edge of my land, warning residents that access would soon be regulated. Survey markers appeared overnight. Contractors drove through roads they had never been allowed to use before. Every move they made was bold, almost careless, as if they believed resistance was impossible. And I let them believe it. I smiled when I saw board members in town. I nodded politely when neighbors asked what was happening. Inside, though, I was building something far more powerful than an argument. I was building a record. Dates, names, documents, statements. Every unauthorized action they took added weight to my position. Silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Behind the scenes, I met with an attorney who specialized in property law, the kind who didn't rush to file lawsuits before understanding the terrain. We laid everything out on the table. The deed history, the HOA amendments, the state protections for agricultural land. He listened quietly, then said something that changed everything. The HOA hadn't just overstepped. They had exposed themselves. By asserting control they didn't legally have, they triggered a chain of consequences under state law. Every notice they issued, every contractor they hired, every representation they made to residents could now be classified as misrepresentation. Worse, the so-called sale of my farm created liability not just for the HOA board, but for individual members who benefited from the arrangement. That's when the plan began to take shape. It wasn't about rushing to court. It was about timing. The law allowed affected property owners to act once harm was clearly established. And harm was coming. The HOA had begun using my land as collateral in negotiations with vendors and lenders, implying stability and control they didn't possess. Once that collapsed, everything tied to it would be questioned. Meanwhile, rumors started circulating in the neighborhood. Some residents had been told their property values would rise because of the new development. Others believed amenities were coming. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew the HOA's authority rested on a lie. I didn't correct them. Not yet. Because the law doesn't reward noise. It rewards precision. And with every passing day, the HOA was tightening the knot around its own neck. They still thought I was reacting emotionally, that I would eventually come begging for a compromise. They couldn't see that the ground beneath them was already shifting. When the time came, I wouldn't need to shout. I would simply present the facts. And once those facts were recognized, the consequences wouldn't stop at my land. They would ripple outward, touching every house the HOA claimed to control. The silence before that moment wasn't empty. It was loaded. The first crack appeared where I didn't expect it. Not in a courtroom or an office, but on a quiet sidewalk near the mailboxes. A homeowner stopped me one evening and asked, casually, if I knew when the farm project was starting. I asked what he meant. He said the HOA newsletter mentioned new access routes and future development plans tied to the land that now belonged to them. That's when I realized the story the board had sold wasn't just about my farm. It was about reassurance. Within days, similar questions followed. Residents wanted to know if construction would affect traffic. Some asked whether their dues would increase. Others wondered why survey crews were placing markers near property lines they thought were fixed. The HOA had promised certainty, but their actions were creating confusion instead. And confusion has a way of spreading faster than facts. Behind closed doors, the board worked overtime to maintain control. Emails went out reminding residents to direct all concerns through official channels. Meetings became shorter, less transparent. Questions were answered with vague assurances and legal language that sounded impressive but explained nothing. That strategy might have worked if no one pushed back. But people always push back when their homes are involved. I continued to document everything. Flyers, emails, meeting minutes. Each statement the HOA made to residents strengthened the pattern of misrepresentation. They weren't just claiming authority over my land anymore. They were using that claim to influence decisions affecting every homeowner. That distinction mattered. It turned a private dispute into a community-wide risk. One evening, a small group of residents gathered after a meeting, voices low, frustration obvious. They compared notes. Promises didn't line up. Timelines shifted. Costs were mentioned, then quietly walked back. Someone asked the question everyone had been avoiding. What if the HOA didn't actually own the land they were talking about? That question changed the atmosphere completely. Doubt crept in, and doubt, once introduced, is impossible to contain. The board sensed it too. Their tone hardened. Enforcement notices increased. Minor violations suddenly mattered. It was pressure, applied deliberately, meant to reassert authority. But it had the opposite effect. Because authority without legitimacy collapses under scrutiny. And scrutiny was coming fast. Requests for records increased. Residents began asking for copies of agreements the HOA claimed existed. The board delayed, deflected, and avoided. Every delay fed suspicion. Every deflection raised new questions. I watched it unfold quietly, knowing the law was already moving in my favor. The HOA's mistake wasn't just selling what they didn't own. It was dragging everyone else into the lie. And when that truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just expose the board. It would force every homeowner to confront what their association had done in their name. The shift didn't happen with a public announcement or a dramatic confrontation. It happened quietly, through certified mail. One by one, envelopes began landing in mailboxes across the neighborhood, each bearing official letterhead and language that couldn't be ignored. These weren't threats. They were notices, carefully worded, legally precise, and impossible to dismiss as rumor. The letters explained a simple truth. The HOA's claimed authority over my 4,000-acre farm was under formal legal challenge. Any decisions, fees, or representations tied to that land were now subject to review. Homeowners were advised to seek independent counsel if they had concerns about how their association had acted. No accusations, no emotional language, just facts. The reaction was immediate. Phones lit up, group chats exploded. Some residents panicked, others were angry, and a few were suddenly very quiet. The HOA board responded with urgency, scheduling an emergency meeting and sending out reassurances that everything was under control. But reassurance only works when people trust the source. That trust was gone. At the meeting, the board attempted to regain command of the room. They spoke about legal complexity and warned against outside interference. They urged unity. What they didn't do was answer direct questions. When asked to provide proof of ownership, they deferred. When asked who approved the sale, they cited confidentiality. Each non-answer dug the hole deeper. Meanwhile, the legal process moved forward methodically. A formal demand was filed, outlining the violations in clear terms. Misrepresentation, unauthorized sale, abuse of administrative authority. Each point referenced statutes, case law, and documented actions taken by the HOA itself. This wasn't an emotional dispute anymore. It was a legal reckoning. The most significant detail came buried in the final pages. Under state law, any contracts or obligations entered into using unlawfully claimed authority could be challenged. That included agreements affecting individual homeowners. The implication was clear. The HOA's actions didn't just threaten my land. They potentially compromised the legal standing of every home tied to the association. Fear began replacing anger. Residents realized they hadn't just been misled. They had been put at risk. And risk changes behavior fast. Attendance at meetings surged. Requests for records multiplied. Some homeowners demanded resignations. Others demanded answers the board couldn't give. I remained in the background, watching momentum build. The law was doing what it does best when applied correctly. It was forcing clarity. The HOA could no longer hide behind confidence and procedure. Every move they made now had consequences. And the next step would determine whether this ended quietly, or reshaped the entire neighborhood forever. The HOA board tried to act fast, but haste only exposed how fragile their position had become. Within days of the letters going out, they hired outside counsel and issued a formal statement insisting the sale was procedurally valid. The language sounded confident, but the timing betrayed panic. They were no longer controlling the narrative. They were reacting to it. Residents started demanding access to records the board had always treated as internal. Contracts, meeting votes, financial disclosures tied to the supposed land transaction. Under pressure, fragments were released. And those fragments didn't match the story residents had been told. Dates conflicted. Authorizations were missing. Signatures appeared without proper votes. Each inconsistency chipped away at what little authority remained. What truly shifted the balance was the audit. A routine review, triggered by homeowner requests, revealed that the HOA had already allocated funds connected to the farm sale. Money had been earmarked for projects that assumed control of land they never lawfully owned. That discovery changed the issue from questionable judgment to potential liability. Suddenly, the board members weren't just defending decisions. They were protecting themselves. Closed-door meetings increased. Legal fees rose. Dues were quietly adjusted to cover costs, which only fueled more resentment. Homeowners who had once ignored HOA politics were now paying close attention. Their homes, their investments, were tied to this mess. I watched as the associations' confidence drained away. Notices became cautious. Enforcement slowed. Projects were paused. Vendors began asking questions, unwilling to proceed without clarity. The HOA's web of authority, once tight and unquestioned, started unraveling strand by strand. Then came the resignation. One board member stepped down, citing personal reasons. Another followed days later. Officially, it was coincidence. Unofficially, it was fear. No one wanted to be the last one standing when accountability arrived. The remaining members attempted to stabilize the situation, but leadership without trust is just noise. Legally, this was the opening I had been waiting for. State law allowed affected parties to assert remedies once misrepresentation caused material harm. Harm had now been documented. Not just to me, but to the community. The HOA's actions had crossed a line where authority dissolved into exposure. What the board still didn't understand was that this wasn't about punishment. It was about correction. The law doesn't seek revenge. It seeks balance. And balance was about to be restored in a way the HOA never anticipated. The final step wouldn't come from confrontation or spectacle. It would come from enforcement. Quiet, binding, irreversible. And when it arrived, it would redefine who truly held control over every property the HOA claimed to manage. When enforcement finally arrived, it didn't come with sirens or headlines. It came through filings that carried the weight of statute and precedent. The county issued notices clarifying the invalidity of the claim transfer, and lenders were informed that the collateral representations tied to the farm were unreliable. That single clarification triggered a cascade the HOA could not stop. Banks paused. Vendors withdrew. Insurers requested explanations. Anything connected to the supposed authority over my land froze instantly. The board tried to reassure residents, but reassurance means nothing when institutions step back. Homeowners began receiving letters of their own, asking them to confirm titles, boundaries, and exposure. Anxiety replaced apathy overnight. Under state remedies, misrepresentation affecting common interest communities allows corrective action to unwind decisions made under false authority. My council filed narrowly tailored petitions, not sweeping accusations. The goal was simple: restore lawful boundaries and nullify actions that relied on the HOA's fabricated control. Courts like precision. We gave them nothing else. The first ruling was administrative and devastating. The sale was void, not voidable, void. It never existed. With that finding, every downstream decision premised on the sale lost its footing. Assessments justified by future development were questioned. Access rules tied to the land were suspended. The HOA's reach shrank back to what it should have been all along. Homeowners felt the shift immediately. Notices stopped arriving. Fines were rescinded. Committees dissolved. The board's emails grew cautious, then rare. Some residents were relieved. Others were furious. Many simply wanted stability. What they got instead was clarity, and clarity is uncomfortable when it exposes long-held assumptions. The most consequential effect was financial. Because the HOA had leveraged authority it didn't possess, affected owners gained standing to challenge obligations entered under that premise. My filings didn't target people, they targeted paperwork. The result was surgical. Properties were released from constraints that never should have applied. Titles were corrected. Records were amended. That correction mattered beyond this case. It set a boundary others would notice. Associations nearby adjusted policies quietly. Attorneys advised caution. Boards reconsidered shortcuts. The lesson traveled without publicity, teaching that paperwork cannot replace ownership, and confidence cannot override statute when someone is willing to read, document, and wait. Long after meetings ended and letters stopped arriving, I stayed out of view, letting the process speak. Enforcement doesn't need a face. It needs facts. And with each correction entered into record, the HOA's story dissolved further, replaced by a legal truth that couldn't be argued away. The neighborhood felt different after enforcement took hold. Not louder, Not dramatic, just quieter in a way that signaled reality settling in. Yard conversations changed. Instead of gossip and complaints, people spoke carefully, weighing every word. Homeowners who had once trusted the law implicitly were now reviewing documents they had never read before. Covenants, amendments, meeting minutes, questions replaced assumptions. Some residents were angry, not at me, but at themselves. They realized how easily authority had been accepted without verification. Others felt embarrassed, remembering how confidently the board had spoken about plans tied to land it never owned. The illusion of control had been comforting. The truth was inconvenient. Requests for independent audits increased. Committees formed without board direction. Neighbors compared notes, uncovering inconsistencies that extended beyond my land. Minor issues that had once seemed isolated now appeared connected. The law hadn't just overreached once. It had built a culture where procedure mattered more than legality, where confidence substituted for consent. The most difficult conversations happened inside homes. Couples discussed potential exposure. Families worried about resale value. Investors reassessed risk. The realization spread that unchecked authority, even when familiar, carries consequences. What unsettled people most wasn't the correction itself. It was how close they had come to being bound by decisions they never approved. I received messages from residents I barely knew. Some thanked me for forcing clarity. Others asked questions, careful not to assign blame. A few admitted they had supported the board simply because it felt easier than questioning it. None of them expected a single dispute to reveal something so fundamental about their community. The law attempted one final reset. A message went out promising transparency and reform. New elections were proposed. Policies were reviewed. It was an effort to survive by adapting. But survival requires trust, and trust requires acknowledgement. That acknowledgement never fully came. Without it, reform felt cosmetic. What endured instead was awareness. Homeowners began attending county workshops. They consulted independent attorneys. They asked better questions. The balance of power shifted permanently, not because of a dramatic victory, but because information had changed hands. My role in it all remained minimal by design. The law had done its work. I hadn't taken something from the community. I had removed something false. The difference mattered. One creates resentment. The other creates understanding, even if it takes time. As records finalized and boundaries were restored, the HOA's reach settled into its proper limits. Smaller, defined, accountable, and while the neighborhood would take time to heal, it would do so with open eyes. The final chapter wasn't about triumph. It was about what happens when people learn the cost of not paying attention. By the time everything settled, there were no winners in the way people usually imagine. No celebrations, no public apologies, just corrected records, restored boundaries, and a community forced to live with what it had learned. My farm was mine again, not because it had ever truly been taken, but because the illusion surrounding it had finally collapsed. The law still existed, but it was smaller in spirit than before. Its authority clearly defined, its actions watched carefully. New board members were elected under stricter rules, and every decision now came with documentation attached. The confidence that once bordered on arrogance was gone, replaced by caution. That change alone was worth more than any settlement. For homeowners, the experience left marks. Some became more involved, attending meetings and asking questions they once avoided. Others chose distance, preferring to protect themselves quietly. But almost all of them shared one thing in common. They no longer assumed someone else had done the homework for them. As for me, I returned to routines that had been interrupted. Walking the fields, checking fences, watching seasons change across land that had outlasted every dispute around it. The farm hadn't needed defending with force or noise. It needed patience, documentation, and the willingness to let the law work the way it was designed to. The lesson wasn't about revenge or domination. It was about limits. HOAs exist within boundaries, just like the properties they manage. When those boundaries are ignored, consequences follow. Quiet ones at first, then unavoidable ones. The law doesn't rush, but it remembers. People still ask if I would have done anything differently. The answer is simple: I would have paid attention sooner. Not because I expected a problem, but because authority should always be understood, never assumed. The cost of ignoring details is rarely immediate, but it is always real. The story didn't end with me taking something from the HOA. It ended with the HOA losing something it should never have claimed. Control without ownership, confidence without consent. Those things don't survive scrutiny. In the end, nothing dramatic was added to my life. Something false was removed from everyone else's. And that made all the difference. The land remained where it had always been. The houses stood where they were built. But the balance between them changed permanently. That balance is fragile. It depends on people reading what they sign, questioning what they're told, and remembering that no organization is above the law simply because it speaks confidently. When those lessons are learned, quietly and collectively, communities don't just recover. They grow stronger in ways that matter.